The Vegan's Dilemma. Hi and welcome to V4 Vegan. I am your host, Anthony McGrath. Today, we will highlight the vegan's dilemma. The issue is that meat is money. A detailed study shows that many of the most disadvantaged persons would suffer the most if the meatpacking industry were to be properly regulated and reduced in size. I'm drawn to an analogy of Gandhi. His campaign of active and non-violent resistance against the colonial empire of Britain in India. He quite rightly figured out that the key industry of cotton, or rather cotton spinning with its subsequent supply chain input into the textile trade, was a key component of the Indian economy. This economy was controlled by the British Empire. To break the control, Gandhi began a campaign of homespinning or homespun, where he encouraged the indigenous population of India to grow their own cotton and spin, and make their own clothes. This campaign was so successful that the textile industry in the UK went into severe recession. The owners then fired the workers, causing hardship and poverty. Upon learning of this, Gandhi travelled to the UK and personally apologized to the workers in the factories, explaining that they were the unintentional victims of the fight for freedom. He begged their forgiveness and also their support for the liberation of the Indian subcontinent. It is in this light I ask you to listen to the following podcast and contemplate how we might improve not only the human condition, but also those of animals, recognizing that we must counterbalance to assist those most in need. Meat is murder. Killing and cutting up the animals we eat has always been bloody, hard, and dangerous work, concentrated in the nation's large cities. Especially in the Midwest, meat-packing plants at the turn of the 20th century were more than sweatshops. They were blood shops, and not only for animal slaughter. The industry operated with low wages, long hours, brutal treatment, and sometimes deadly exploitation of mostly immigrant workers. Meatpacking companies had equal contempt for public health. Upton Sinclair's classic 1906 novel, The Jungle, exposed real-life conditions in meatpacking plants to a horrified public. But what most shocked the popular conscience was Sinclair's portrayal of vermin, animal feces, human blood, and body parts going into meat people ate, and the deceptive practices used to sell such adulterated product. Sinclair's expose led directly to the rapid passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906. The American public paid little attention to the treatment of the central character of Sinclair's novel, a Lithuanian immigrant named Jurgis Rudkus, who worked in the meatpacking plant. Sinclair reportedly lamented, "I aimed at the public's heart and I hit it in the stomach." Inside the plants, workers faced constant wage cuts, production line speed up, injuries and disease, and instant dismissal and blacklisting if they protested conditions. Outside, they lived with no medical care, no education, and no decent housing. Rudkus and his co-workers were aliens both legally and culturally, not citizens, unable to speak good English, ignorant of their rights, and afraid to turn to governmental authorities for help. A century later, abusive working conditions and treatment still torment a mostly immigrant labor force in the American meatpacking industry. In the early 20th century, addressing wages, hours, and working conditions for meatpacking employees took more than an electrifying novel. Gaining ground. It took the large-scale trade union organizing drives of the 1930s by the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, and the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. CIO organizing was best known in the auto, steel, electrical, and rubber industries, but industrial organizations reached meatpacking factories too. Workers formed the United Packing House Workers of America, UPWA, and bargained collectively with Wilson, Swift, Armour, and other large beef and pork processing firms. As one of the CIO's progressive unions that stressed class consciousness and racial and ethnic solidarity, the UPW was known for its internal democracy and openness to African American and immigrant workers, as well as women's participation and leadership in the union. For about 40 years in the middle of the 20th century, from the 1930s to the 1970s, meatpacking workers' pay and conditions improved. Master contracts covering the industry raised wages and safety standards. In the 1960s and 1970s, meatpacking workers' pay and conditions approximated those of auto, steel, and other industrial laborers. Meatpackers' wages remained substantially higher than the average manufacturing sector wage, 15% higher in 1960, 19% higher in 1970, and 17% higher in 1980. Sliding back, the 1990s saw the destruction of good jobs in the meatpacking industry. Many companies relocated from decades-old, multi-story urban factories to single-floor layouts in rural areas closer to cattle and hog feedlots. New companies became industry powerhouses, especially Iowa Beef Processors, IBP. IBP overtook old line producers by automating more of the process, squeezing skills out of the job. IBP reduced every stage in the process to mindless, repetitive cutting with the same hand and arm motion in what the industry calls a disassembly line process. IBP and its copycat producers stepped up line speed and cut wages to levels far underneath union-negotiated standards. In 1983, meatpacking workers' pay fell below the average U.S. manufacturing wage for the first time. Since then, the decline has accelerated, 15% lower in 1985, 18% lower in 1990, 24% lower in 2002. Employers transformed the sector during the 1980s from one in which workers had secure organizations bargaining on their behalf to one where self-organization was a high-risk gauntlet for workers. Where they did not relocate, many companies shut down their plants, dismissed their long-time organized workers, and then reopened with a non-union immigrant workforce. An early business profile of the new reality of meatpacking industry labor described the dynamic this way: Iowa Beef Processors rewrote the rules for killing, chilling, and shipping beef. The company has fought tenaciously to hold down labor costs. Though some of its plants are unionized, it refused to pay the wages called for in the United Food and Commercial Workers UFCW Expensive Master Agreement, which the elders of the industry have been tied to for 40 years. Iowa Beef's wages and benefits average half those of less hard-nosed competitors. If a company chooses to hang tough in slaughter, there's only one way to go: imitate Iowa Beef and become a low-cost producer. IPCO is pressing hard into the boxed beef business and has launched a frontal assault on labour costs. Esmart shut down 3 slaughterhouses and paid the necessary severance and closing costs. Then SIP/CO reopened the plant. That ploy allowed the company to wriggle out of the UFCW's master agreement and hire workers who would toil at reduced wages and benefit. Employers fiercely resisted organizing efforts by workers in the new plants and the reopened plant. Firing key leaders and threatening to close plants where workers tried to form new unions were common tactics. Threats were all the more credible in the wake of companies' widespread closures of union-represented plants in urban centers. Where workers in new plants succeeded in organizing, they often had to endure long, bitter strikes to win contracts with marginal improvement. As the traditional structure of the industry and its labor relations fragmented, employers drove many workers' wages down to a fraction of what they had been, with parallel worsening of benefits and working conditions. The frequency of meatpacking workplace injuries soared. Injury rates had been in line with other manufacturing sectors with trade union representation, but since the breakdown of national bargaining agreements, meatpacking has become the most dangerous factory job in America, with injury rates more than twice the national average. From little chicken to big chicken, the trajectory of the poultry industry was different, but it has ended at the same place today. Until the second half of the century, killing and cutting up chickens for human consumption was undertaken primarily by small enterprises operating locally. The poultry processing industry was based mainly in the South, thanks to a chicken-raising tradition, cheap land, low heating and cooling costs for raising large numbers of birds in enclosed conditions, and low wages for unorganized workers. In the 1930s, a Northwest Arkansas farmer named John Tyson saw an opportunity to ship chickens to St. Louis and Chicago for next-day sale in markets there. After 3 decades of developing egg and chicken processing operations in Arkansas, Tyson Foods acquired 19 other businesses in the late 1960s and was on its way to becoming the largest chicken processor in the world. The company did not stop there. In the last half of the 20th century, attracted by price, convenience, and health claims, Americans tripled their per capita consumption of chicken. Tyson Foods rode America's gastronomical revolution to the top of the food processing business. Getting millions of processed chickens to supermarket shelves every day became a gigantic business, not only for Tyson, but for other major chicken producers like Perdue, Pilgrim's Pride, Holly Farms, and Hudson Foods. Success in the marketplace depended on achieving expanded operations with economies of scale, low costs, and accelerated production speed. The industry stayed based in the South. Poultry plants in southern states employ nearly 300,000 workers and supply nearly 90% of the nation's broilers. Meat and chicken combine. As the tiny chicken gradually overtook the mighty steer and hog on America's dinner tables, Tyson's growth in poultry portended its ultimate emergence as the world's largest processor and marketer of chicken, beef, and pork combined. The company bought out Holly Farms and Hudson Foods in the 1990s. During this era, IBPN consolidated its position as the biggest meat and pork producer in the United States. In 2001, Tyson Foods swallowed up IBP in an acquisition. In 2003, Tyson announced the end of the IBP brand in connection with a unified marketing strategy under the Tyson name. In Upton Sinclair's day, 5 meatpacking companies made up the fabled Chicago-based Beef Trust that dominated the American red meat market. Today, several firms, such as Tyson, Perdue, and Pilgrim's Pride in Chicken, Tyson, Excel, and Swift in Beef, and Tyson and Smithfield in Pork, bestride the meat and poultry sectors in the United States. Smaller processors like Farmland Foods, Hormel Foods, Sara Lee Meats, and others fill product niches and regional market. Tyson by itself is twice as big by any measure pounds or head of production, number of plants, or number of employees as the next largest meat packing or poultry processing firm. Bringing in the third world. Large quantities of meat are heavy and bulky to ship long distances by air or sea, and the perishable nature of these products usually requires that high volume, mass market production take place within quick reach of retail outlets. International trade in meat products is usually specialized in premium and niche product lines. Chickens are easier to transport and can be exported in large quantities with sufficient economies of scale. For example, in normal times, more than 5% of Americans' chicken production is exported to Russia. An avian flu outbreak in the early 2004 cut back on American chicken exports, but the market was expected to return. Unlike workers in many manufacturing sectors, most meat and poultry workers do not face employers' threats to move their plants to other countries where wages and workers are suppressed. Some analysts argue, however, that this fact has not blocked a third world strategy by the American meat and poultry industry. They contend that instead of exporting production to developing countries for low labor costs, lax health, safety, and environmental enforcement, and vulnerable exploited workers, American meat and poultry companies essentially are reproducing developing country employment conditions here. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, the meatpacking industry was returning to the jungle. A new best-selling book, this time non-fiction, caught the public's imagination. Author Eric Schlosser used the astonishing growth of McDonald's and other fast food restaurants as the hook to expose, as he put it, what lurks between those sesame seed buns. With its engrossing portrayal of firms cutting food safety corners, putting workers' lives and limbs at risk, exploiting immigrants, and other abuses that recall Chicago packing plants a century ago, Schlosser's fast food nation is as shocking as Sinclair's jungle. The stories told by meat and poultry industry workers interviewed for this report echo Schlosser's account. Published improvements. Over the past 3 years, the median advertised online wage for workers in the meat and dairy industries has risen 33.7% from $14.95 to $20 per hour. Metropolitan areas with the highest demand for meat and dairy workers included Houston, Omaha, San Antonio, Austin, and Los Angeles. States with the highest number of postings included Texas, California, Iowa, and North Carolina. In fiscal year 2021, meat and dairy employers requested a combined total of 34,245 H-2A and H-2B workers. The U.S. Department of Labor certified 32,071 of those workers. Of those 32,071 temporary workers certified, 30,088 H-2 are visa holders. More than 93.8% work in the meat industry, typically hired to tend to livestock or maintain the machinery and buildings on the farm. More than 90,000 workers breed, raise, and tend to animals on farms, ranches, livestock yards, and animal confinement facilities across the country. 1 in 5 livestock workers, or 20%, are foreign-born, a significantly higher percentage than the national share of foreign-born workers for all industries combined, which is 17.4%. During the early days of the pandemic, the share of foreign-born meatpacking workers was 45.4%, 28 percentage points higher than the average share for all industries combined. From 2019 to 2022, the number of unique online job postings for meatpacking workers increased by 86.4%. To mitigate the labor shortage, meat producers have called for the federal government to expand the H-2B visa program to allow year-round visas in addition to the seasonal visas allowed today. More than 1 in 4 transportation workers in the meat industry are foreign-born, 26% a higher share than that of all transportation workers combined, 19.1%. From 2019 to 2022, the number of unique online job postings for transportation workers in the meat industry doubled by 115%. Nearly 1 in 5 workers on dairy farms are immigrants. Not so humane. American meatpacking plants were COVID hotspots in the earliest months of the pandemic. Almost 60,000 workers at the nation's 5 largest meatpacking companies were infected by COVID, and yet, for months, meatpacking corporations resisted adding mitigation measures to their plants. They lobbied to force employees to continue working, even as outbreaks that began in their plants spread into local communities. How was that allowed to happen? This spring, the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis released a barely noticed report that answers that question. The committee found that billion-dollar meatpacking companies, including Tyson, JBS Smithfield Foods, Cargill, and National Beef Packing Company, were in regular, frequent, and private contact with the highest levels of the Trump administration. The contact went beyond lobbying. The House report finds that the meat packers misled the public about the nation's meat supply, drafted versions of an executive order later signed by Donald Trump, and even directly shaped watered-down mitigation guidance issued by the CDC. In a press release on April 12, 2020, Smithfield's CEO and President Kenneth Sullivan wrote that the closure of the facility in Colorado is pushing our country perilously close to the edge in terms of our meat supply. It is impossible to keep our grocery stores stocked if our plants are not running. But reports show this meat shortage was all a lie. According to an expert at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, there was so much pork in cold storage as of March 2020 that it would have been sufficient to supply grocery shelves for approximately the next 14 months. Meat processors generated record profits during the pandemic, with net margins as high as 300%. Meat is money. The American meat and poultry industry accounts for over $1 trillion in total economic output, or 5.6% of gross domestic product, according to a new economic impact study by the North American Meat Institute. As the movement away from meat grows, we must ensure that those who cannot protect themselves are protected by those who have profited from them. We must educate and legislate for transitional programs to reflect a growing need for humanity, both on the table and in the workplace. This is your host, Anthony McGrath, signing off until next time, encouraging you to keep it green.
This has been a production of Spirit Quest Publications, a division of Anthony and Mary Holistic Health Services, LLC. All rights reserved.